Good evening, and welcome to Making Michigan, the Bentley Historical Library's series on the history of the University of Michigan. I'm Andrew Rutledge, Bentley historian and research associate, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you tonight to the historic Judy and Stanley Frankel Detroit Observatory, a division of the Bentley. I also want to welcome our online audience on YouTube. Thank you all for joining us on, well, chilly is a bit of an understatement, December evening. Tonight, we have a very exciting and very timely talk. For this year, the University of Michigan community is celebrating the 175th anniversary of Michigan medicine, encompassing both the health system and the medical school, which opened its doors in 1850. And there's also a second anniversary this year, because 100 years ago this fall, the university opened the massive hospital known as Old Main, designed by famous Detroit architect Albert Kahn, and which is one of the sort of iconic buildings on U of M's campus, even if it's no longer standing. It has been replaced by this amazing Michigan hospital system that, well, you can't see it because there's a wall behind you, but I promise it's this way. But as iconic as Old Main is, our speaker tonight, Professor Laura Hirshbein, is here to share with us the story of another site of healing that was just as revolutionary and is celebrating its 70th anniversary this year, the Children's Psychiatric Hospital. When it first opened its doors in 1955, it was the result of enormous planning and very careful effort that had gone into creating a program centered around the then cutting-edge approach of psychoanalysis. But it also sought to research and address the issues of its patients, ranging from the cells in their bodies to the relationship to broader society. And it worked on this and sought to heal patients for decades. And there is no one better suited to tell the hospital story than Laura Hirshbein, the George E. Wantz, MD, Distinguished Professor of the History of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry here at U of M. Who received her MD from the University of Michigan and her PhD from Johns Hopkins University, and who has written extensively on the history of psychiatry, health policy, and diagnosis, with a particular focus on children's healthcare services. If that's not the perfect person to talk about this hospital, I don't know who is. So please join me in welcoming Professor Hirshbein.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you very much for the invitation to come here, and thanks to my friends from psychiatry for coming as well. I really want to hear your perspectives from having experienced some of this history. I want to hear some stories. And if there are people online who have stories to share, I would love to hear them. So what I have is my perspective, which is somewhat of having been here long enough that I remember when CPH was still standing. When I started medical school here, it was still on campus. But a lot of what I have is from the historical record, and so what I'm missing are people's stories. So I would love to hear stories. If people want to email me or call, I'd love to hear them. So I want to start with Raymond Wagner, who was chair of the Department of Psychiatry from 1937 to 1970. So Ray Wagner didn't like to be told no. He really wanted what he wanted when he wanted it, and he was very successful in getting that. And in 1950, he invited a husband and wife psychiatry team, Ralph Rabinowitz and Sarah Dubo, to come from Bellevue in New York to staff a children's psychiatric service here at the university. At the time that he invited them, the idea of having child psychiatry in a university setting was actually kind of unusual. We don't think twice about the fact that there are children's subspecialties here, lots of different specialties. But child psychiatry was actually not born in an academic setting, and it was not even born in the same kind of setting as adult psychiatry. So adult psychiatry was born in institutions. So these are some pictures of institutions from the state of Michigan, mostly from the 19th century. Psychiatry as a specialty originated in large hospitals in what were known as insane asylums. This was the scientific term of the time. What is now the American Psychiatric Association was originally the Association of Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane. I can only ever say that once in a talk. I can't repeat it. But that is now the American Psychiatric Association. It was founded in 1844, 3 years before the American Medical Association. And what is now the American Journal of Psychiatry was originated in 1846 as the American Journal of Insanity. That was the technical term of the time. But child psychiatry was not part of this. So this organization, as sort of what psychiatry was, originated in buildings, but children weren't there. And so child psychiatry as a specialty really originated in the world of juvenile delinquency, of child courts. Children who got in trouble, really in the early 20th century, they were picked up off the street, they were brought in by concerned parents, and parents were very concerned that, and judges were concerned that these kids needed guidance. They needed to be put on the right path so that they didn't destroy our country by getting into crime and doing all sorts of terrible things. And so child psychiatry really originated from the idea of rescuing children, from guiding them in the right place in what were called child guidance clinics that were mostly in cities like New York, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, but not in medical centers. And so what Wagner wanted to do, and you know, I'm not going to try to claim he was a pioneer. He was a little bit ahead of some of the game, but he was really interested in expanding the reach of psychiatry. And so one of the things that Wagner did, along with some other institutions, was he tried to get away from some of these state hospitals, these big institutions that were not connected with universities, and get psychiatric patients into academic settings. So here's a picture of the front of Old Main, as Andrew mentioned, the pioneering, our big hospital that was opened in 1925. On the back of it was something called NPI, Neuropsychiatric Institute. So there are people around who are still very much around and practicing who remember the old days of NPI. And so NPI was built in 1937. There had been a psychiatric institute that was smaller for sort of the study of patients. It was really more neurology than what we would now consider neurology than anything else. But psychiatry moved into this building, NPI, which was attached to the back of Old Main. I'll show you some aerial pictures in a minute. And so Wagner was trying to expand psychiatry into an academic setting, and part of what he wanted to do was include children. And so there were, in addition to the child guidance stuff that was going on with courts, there was also a growing movement of people who wanted to use this new scientific tool of psychoanalysis to help with children. And the idea that, you know, for many of us, we don't think of psychoanalysis as new, as scientific, as a tool. We think of it as very old-fashioned, right? People lie on the couch, they free associate, you know, they uncover their unconscious conflicts. It's like, it feels very old-fashioned. But Sigmund Freud actually developed psychoanalysis as a tool to understand how the brain works. He tried doing brain dissections in the 1880s along with everybody else in Germany at the time and didn't find what he was looking for. And so he started looking at thoughts. And so he theorized that people's problems came from unconscious conflicts that developed when they were children. And so his approach was to ask people about their childhoods. Well, other people, including his daughter, Anna Freud, said, well, why don't we just talk to the kids? Let's not wait until they grow up and talk about it. Let's actually analyze children. And so in the 1930s and 40s, there was a growing number of people, it's still small, but a growing number of people. Some of them were actually physicians. Some of them were not. Some of them were educators. Anna Freud was actually a teacher. She wasn't a physician. There were social workers. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But people who were interested in adapting this tool of psychoanalysis to really understand child development. This was again, cutting edge. So what Wagner wanted to do was to bring these things, child guidance, child psychoanalysis, into academia. And so when he invited Rabinowitz and Dubov, there was a tiny little unit at NPI that was supposed to house 25 kids. That when they built the building in 1937, that was the plan, except they never really got it off the ground. It opened and then it closed, and then some things broke, and then they opened it again, and then the war happened. And so then all the children's beds during the war got repurposed for soldiers. So by the late 1940s, they finally opened it. There was a unit of 25 beds, all in big wards. So the wards were like 3 to 8 kids in a room. 20 of the beds were reserved for boys, 5 for girls. So this was very standard for child psychiatry, that 80% really of the kids who received psychiatric or were brought for psychiatric attention were boys. They acted up, they were rambunctious, they broke things, they didn't listen, all the kinds of stuff, and so they got brought to the hospital. So when Wagner was trying to build the children's program, there were a couple of people who worked there, but nobody who had a ton of expertise. And Rabinowitz and Dubov were working with somebody in New York named Loretta Bender, who was a big a big deal. She was doing ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, with children with schizophrenia back in the 40s, which was wild. It was brave, and some people said foolish, some people said amazing, but she was doing some really cutting edge stuff. And so Rabinowitz and Dubot worked with her. They were doing some basically physical interventions. They were also doing psychoanalysis, and they really had a very broad idea about what it meant to do child psychiatry. And so Wagner was able to bring them in to work here, and his idea was, okay, we'll bring them onto this tiny little service and then we'll build something more. So here is a picture of an aerial view of the medical center, and I think you can see, well, you know, what's helpful whenever you look at these aerial photos is you can locate the observatory. That tells you where everything is. That's a great marker. Huh. Oh, we have a, let's see. No. All right, well, all right. If you look sort of at behind the big X that is Old Main, you can see NPI sort of back there. It's not critical, I just sort of wanted to kind of give you, I'll be showing repeated pictures of the aerial views so you can see over time. So Ralph Rabinowitz, and I cannot find a picture of his wife anywhere, but this is Ralph, and he and Sarah Dubot were really a power couple. They were both very accomplished in child psychiatry, both published. She kept her own name, which is pretty cool at the time. And so when they were brought here, Rabinowitz helped run the inpatient service such as it was, and Dubot did child psychiatry consults. And so what she did was she went and interviewed kids who were sort of scattered around the main hospital. So the main, as I'll talk about more in a minute, Old Main didn't have any dedicated space for kids. They were sort of scattered in different wards, kind of all over, and there were some sort of pockets for kids, but there was no dedicated children's hospital. So Dubot went around to the children's wards and interviewed them, and at the time, people really believed that emotional factors were as important as physical ones in children's health, and so she did studies of emotional factors in tuberculosis, looking at how those affected how kids healed, and saying that some of those were even more important than physical things. She actually was kind of funny. She published about this in, I think, 1950 and 51. Before she and Ralph came here, she was doing studies on kids in New York. And she wanted to look at emotional factors, but in New York, what she found was that the bigger concern was basically ventilation at home. These kids who were crammed into these little tenements in New York City got sick, and it didn't really matter what their emotional adjustment was, that they just were in bad environments. So she kept trying. So I think here she had more success in looking at emotional factors. But what Ralph Rabinowitz with Wagner, they looked at what we would now consider kind of a continuity of care, a continuum of care. What did kids need and when did they need it? So as I said, we didn't start off with this idea in child psychiatry of hospitalizing everyone, unlike adults, where we started hospitalizing everyone and then moved into outpatient clinics. With kids, it was starting in the outpatient world. And so what Rabinowitz and Wagner tried to figure out is, at what point in treatment, when did kids need to be taken away from their families and put somewhere else for a more healing environment? And so Rabinowitz did this diagram looking at stepped treatment. You start from basic outpatient, occasional therapy, and escalate it. And then at a certain point, and here it's like level 5, the kids are too disturbed to be at home. They're too disturbed at home, too disturbed in school. They need to come into a hospital setting. And that was a great model. The problem is, in the state of Michigan, there was nowhere to put them. There was very little training for child psychiatry in the state. And so what Wagner and Rabinowitz wanted to do was build momentum to build a new hospital here. So they had a conference in 1953 where they invited not only experts, including Loretta Bender, they also invited state legislators to come and hear the expertise. And so they talked about psychoanalytic interventions, they talked about all kinds of stuff. What the state legislators heard was, this is a need, and this is something that the University of Michigan can provide for the rest of the state, which was the goal. That's what Wagner wanted to do. So what Wagner and Rabinowitz and then the chairman of the Department of Pediatrics did was they went to the state in 1953 and said, what we want to do is build a comprehensive children's center. And we want to include children's medical concerns and their psychiatric concerns. There was no separate children's hospital. Some other institutions had a children's hospital. We needed one. And they wanted to build this together, this whole thing. So it's supposed to be 200 beds, 200 medical beds, 75 psychiatric beds. So this is the side view of the, back when they used to make models. These things, really cute. This is the front view of the model. So this was the plan, and they went to the state legislature and said, this is what we want to do. And the state said, well, are we sure about this? You know, Ann Arbor is pretty far from everywhere else. There had been a conversation about building a children's hospital in Northville, but Wagner was able to convince the state legislature, and the scuttlebutt in the department has always been that Wagner had a relative in the state legislature, which gave him a little bit more juice and a little bit more influence. I cannot find that substantiated, but that rumor is everywhere. Everyone I've ever talked to has said, well, you know, he had connections. But the state was convinced that children's health was important. They were convinced that children's psychiatric help was needed. And Wagner was able to prevail on them to say that it was worthwhile building here because what the University of Michigan could make up for in size, we couldn't take care of everybody in the state, but what we could do is train people. So it was supposed to be a training center for psychiatrists, for nurses, for occupational therapists, for special education, you name it, the dietetics, all kinds of people were supposed to come here and train. And so what Wagner succeeded, he managed to get the state legislature on board. And so this is what they built in 1955, Children's Psychiatric Hospital, CPH. So you'll notice this is only one part, right? So this was the original plan. So you'll see on the left, there's that big thick wall. So everything to the left of that big thick wall is psychiatry. And then, but the medical part wasn't built. So that was the plan was to start with psychiatry. The state ran out of money and refused to support the building of the pediatrics side. I think there was some friction between Wagner and the chair of pediatrics, who was not very happy that psychiatry got the priority. And actually, just a sort of a little aside, there wasn't a children's hospital until 1969 when the pediatrics department went to the Mott Foundation in Flint and managed to convince them to build a children's hospital here, even though the foundation had no interest in Ann Arbor and didn't build children's hospitals, but they still managed to make the case. So our first Mott Hospital was built in 1969 after the debacle of collaborating with psychiatry. And one of the things that I found really funny in the archives is that in the late 60s and early 70s, Wagner had the temerity to go to the pediatrics department and say, hey, you need to give us some space in your new building because we need to do more with child psychiatry, even though you could argue that psychiatry managed to torpedo the pediatrics hospital for a while. So CPH was state of the art. It had a swimming pool. It had a big lobby. And I'll show you in a minute, it was prime real estate on the medical center campus. I think you can see in the lobby picture on the left that they actually had that model of the whole building. They had it in the lobby for a while. There were communal areas, so having attention to actually how kids interacted with each other and how they interacted with adults was part of the treatment. And so this was part of the psychoanalytic basis of inpatient treatment. The kids would come in, and the idea was that the staff would substitute for their families and give them an opportunity to work through all of their unconscious conflicts that they had with their families. So the intent was to remove kids from their home environment and put them in this nice place and give them a chance to interact with people. I don't think they necessarily kind of went in thinking this, but the length of stays turned out to be astronomically long, like 2 years was kind of the average. And so the kids, the staff put a huge amount of effort into working with each and every kid. Discharge planning took a month. They would go and visit the home and visit the school, and then they would discharge the kid for a few days and then bring them back, and kids would go home for vacations. and then come back, and they would go to school in the hospital. They would go on field trips. This was really a substitute, and the idea, again, was to have the staff substitute for family. What was also really interesting is the attendants, the people who worked with kids on a daily basis, what we now call PCWs, psychiatric care workers, they just called them attendants. They were University of Michigan students. They would hire them to come in, often like psychology majors. They would come in and work with the kids, and then often would go on to careers in mental health. And that worked out great, except that there were a few things apparently that the college student attendants weren't very good with. They struggled when the adolescent kids were starting to express some sexual feelings. The students were like, oh, no, we can't do that. So it was a little bit of a gap there. But there was this family, everybody interacting. They did a lot of teamwork with the kids on this unit. The picture of the bedroom up there on the right, this looks very institutional now, to our modern eyes. At the time, this was really actually pretty luxurious because it was a room with only 2 beds instead of 8. And the goal, was, as they said at the time, was they wanted it to be home-like, but not too much, because they didn't want kids to get too attached. They wanted them to be able to go home when it was time, but it was to be home-like. There were lots of activities, always age and sex appropriate, according to the dictates of the time. So the girls did cooking, the boys did workshops. They had one tiny little TV in the room with a ping pong table. So again, lots and lots of activities. And the hospital newspaper has all kinds of stories about the boys did soapbox derbies, the girls did fashion shows. They had all kinds of stuff to make sure that these kids had an opportunity to feel normal. That was the goal. This was different enough in terms of what to expect that the staff at CPH created a pamphlet for parents, basically to help them understand what was supposed to be happening with their kids. And they explained the psychoanalytic theory to some extent. I mean, it was pretty, not a whole lot of jargon, which is good. But they explained kind of what they were trying to do with the kids. And this was seen as really important and really cutting edge in the state. So the CPH got a lot of press coverage. This was an article, I think, in the Ann Arbor News. And part of the idea here is this: someone cares. The implication was that kids were not cared for at home, but they needed to know that they were loved and cared for in the hospital. So that was a mentality behind most of their interventions. And before there were our therapy dog team, CPH had a dog. They had Skeezer. I've heard different stories about this. I heard that Skeezer sort of wandered into somebody's life. I'm not sure if it was there's a physician who claimed credit. I don't know if that's accurate or not. John McDermott claimed credit, but I think it was actually a nurse who took care of Skeezer. But Skeezer had puppies while staying at CPH, and the kids all helped raise the puppies. And this was a compelling enough story. Somebody wrote a book about it, and then they made it into a made-for-TV movie in 1982, starring Karen Valentine, who was a big 1980s made-for-TV movie actress. The dog in the movie version of Skeezer was much more attractive than this. Looks more like Benji rather than this little bit of a mutt here. So there was lots of staff interaction and lots of training that did happen at CPH. So there was a whole generation of school teachers who were trained at CPH who worked, and at Children's Hospital at Mott, when the kids were at Old Main and then when they were at Mott, there was a growing cadre of special education teachers who basically developed a field of special education around hospitalized children. And psychiatry, the teachers in psychiatry actually led the way. So they did a lot of innovating, how do you engage a kid who's in the hospital? How do you adapt what you're doing? And the education piece was huge. It was front and center. They spent a lot of time and effort on this. And so CPH really did fulfill that mission that Wagner had promised the state legislature. But one of the things, when Wagner went to the state and got funding, he said that clinical care was going to be there, but it wasn't going to be huge because we just didn't have enough space for all the kids from the state, all the kids who needed it. We were going to train people, but also we were going to do research. That was what he promised. And so there actually was a huge amount of research that was published through CPH. And I was frankly shocked when I started to see all of it because, you know, I think psychoanalysis, I think how do you do research with psychoanalysis? But there was a ton. And a lot of it was inspired by Anna Freud. So Anna Freud, again, took her father's ideas around the idea of unconscious conflicts in childhood and said, okay, we think that's happening, but we need to actually talk to the kids. Let's talk to the kids, let's observe them, let's get to know them. And her method was a long process of examining each and every aspect of a child's development and really observing and spending a lot of time and effort and care in understanding how they interacted with other kids, how they interacted with their families, how they understood themselves, and really trying to gather information. And so she inspired generations of psychoanalytic researchers, including several from here who developed internationally known programs. So as an example of some of the research and some of the training, there is I think it's the Hospital Star, which is the hospital publication, showed a picture of one of our psychiatry residents, and she's working with an 8-year-old boy who has the diagnosis of schizophrenia. In the time, probably what people were calling childhood schizophrenia in the 40s, 50s, and 60s was what we would probably call autism now, but at the time that was the diagnosis. And so the caption on this picture reads, the boy, quote, displayed homicidal tendencies when admitted to the hospital. The youngster has identified one of the doll figures with his father, thereby giving important insights into his subconscious. So they did play therapy. They gave the kids clay and dolls and had them act out what was going on, and that's how they knew what was happening. And so they were researching, they were gathering data, and training psychiatrists in how to do this. Which is really interesting. The other thing that they were doing is looking at every aspect of life in children for how to pull together some research. So here was an Ann Arbor News coverage of Children's Psychiatric Hospital, and this was part of a series on psychiatry research across the university. And the Mental Health Research Institute that was actually built the same year as CPH, another one of Wagner's brainchilds, had psychiatry research literally from cell to society. He had people looking at microscopes to try to understand neurochemistry, and he had a historian and a sociologist on faculty looking at this. And so with the Children's Psychiatric Hospital, it was the same thing, looking everywhere from how kids interacted with each other to studying how blind children responded to sound. And so just research in every way you can think of in all kinds of methods. So two of the biggest stars at CPH in the 60s and 70s were both psychoanalysts, Selma Freiberg and Humberto Nájera. Freiberg is well known for many people in early childhood education. She wrote something called The Magic Years before she came here. She actually she was a social worker who was trained kind of under the table in Detroit. She wasn't supposed to be trained as a psychoanalyst because at that time in the 40s when she was getting her training, only psychiatrists were supposed to be trained in psychoanalysis. That was the American way. The Europeans didn't like that, but that's how it was done in the United States. And so there were two psychoanalysts in Detroit who trained Freiberg. She went to Wayne State for college. And the Detroit folks got into trouble with this. And actually, the Detroit Psychoanalytic Institute got its accreditation yanked because she was being trained when she wasn't supposed to be. So they got it back, but it was dicey there for a while. But so she was in Michigan, got her psychoanalytic training, went to Tulane for a few years, and then got recruited back. And Freiberg's big thing was that she did very careful research with blind infants. And so she worked with a handful of families. I think there was like 8 to 12 at one point, where she looked at how do you assess development with a child who can't see mother, especially. Freiberg was obsessed with mothers and babies. And so she did long exploration. She videotaped them. She had her staff go to the homes, and she created an infant mental health program here that became internationally known, and managed to bring in quite a number of grants. So she was very prominent and did a lot of really important work. And she was, her title here was Professor of Psychoanalysis, which is really interesting because we didn't have official psychoanalytic training here. That was not something that was okay in a medical center. And so she was a big deal. The other big deal was Humberto Nájera, who was a Cuban psychiatrist who did much of his child psychiatry training in London with Anna Freud, and was good enough friends with her that they continued a correspondence after he came to Michigan, and those letters got published. So it was like he's like psychoanalytic royalty to be that close to Anna Freud. These two were the biggest lights at CPH and apparently hated each other, as only psychoanalysts fighting in the same field could be. The scuttlebutt is that Nájera was maybe a little too enamored of his own opinions. Freiberg certainly had her opinions. She wrote a book called, God, I'm forgetting the first part of it. The second part of it is called In Defense of Mothering. What's interesting is she and Nájera hated each other, but they both agreed that daycare was the root of all evil, and that it would destroy our nation if mothers didn't stay home with their children, taking care of all of their basic needs. So they agreed on that. They couldn't agree on anything else. And Freiberg, she had a lot of trouble with Nájera, who was at least ostensibly her boss, and then ultimately left, tragically died of brain cancer only like a year after she left here, so she died in 1981. Nájera lived until 2016. He left the university to go to Florida, I think in the 80s. All right, so to sort of think about where we are, so if you can see, let's see if you can see this. So if you orient yourself by looking at Old Main, which is the big sort of X-looking thing, kind of right in the middle, CPH is, if it's sort of behind it, yeah, I don't know if you can see this. All right. CPH is, if you look at the street that we now know as Medical Center Drive, it's on the street. You can see that the very distinctive blank wall. So it's on the street next to what is the medical center. So you can see the medical center. So CPH had a big circular drive in front of it that in emergencies, the hospital would land the helicopter there. Wagner was very mad about that because it would disrupt the children. But this, you can see this is prime real estate, that the Children's Hospital was right there. There's a blank space next to it, a green spot sort of directly behind the Old Main. That had been the Veterans Readjustment Center in the 40s and 50s, and it got torn down, and that's where what is now University Hospital got built. It was called the Replacement Hospital in the late 70s and early 80s. But at one point, again, Children's Psychiatric Hospital was like again, prime real estate on the drive in front of, next to the medical school. All right. So by the late 70s, right by the 70s, things started to get a little trickier for CPH. One is they lost their big champion, Ray Wagner. He retired in 1970. Al Silverman took over as chair in 1970, and he inherited a bit of a mess. So part of the two things that Wagner had going for him, apart from the fact that he had a gigantic personality, knew everybody, and was able to do everything, and maybe had a relative in the state legislature, he also inherited, Wagner had a line item from the state that was to fund the Department of Psychiatry. There was the university budget, and then there was the Department of Psychiatry. And that's some historical reasons for that, and a lot of luck, but that was the funding stream. And so Wagner didn't have to worry about money. He was funded. In 1970, in the early 70s, when state budgets really hit, Silverman was told basically, yeah, you're not getting that line item anymore. We're going to take that away. And so he had a choice to either have the funding in the state mental health budget or included in the university budget. And he chose the university, which in hindsight was very wise. The university has done much better than the mental health programs in the state. But the department still, you ask people, they still try to say that Silverman gave away the money. He didn't give away the money. The money was taken from him. But this is still the story. The other thing that Silverman was left with, that people still blamed him for, was that many of the child psychiatrists, and Nahara was a huge part of this. Many of the child psychiatrists were psychoanalysts who worked part-time at the university and then had part-time private practices. So the University of Michigan Medical Center has never allowed part-time faculty. That, like, in terms of like you work part-time at the university and then you have your private practice on the side. That is not the model. The model has always been full-time faculty for lots of really interesting and some really good reasons and some maybe not so good reasons. But psychiatry was an exception, and the dean had made exceptions for some of these analysts. And what these analysts would do, and again, Nahara was a big part of this, they had private psychoanalytic patients who would come to their offices at CPH, and the analysts would see them, but they weren't University of Michigan patients. They were their own private patients. And so in the early 70s, Silverman was told, yeah, you can't do this anymore. You can't make exceptions for your faculty. Everybody has to be full-time. So most of the analysts left. Not necessarily right that minute, but over the next 15, 20 years, they left. And there was a big exodus in different waves, but they just didn't find that working full-time for the university was something that they could do. So Silverman tried to deal with this. He did everything he could. It was a big, messy time. People, again, still talk about it. And so, but he tried, and he was trained in psychoanalysis, so he at least was somewhat sympathetic. John Graydon had very little patience with psychoanalysis. He was and remains very much, brain chemistry is where it is. We need to be focusing on science, and he didn't see psychoanalysis as scientific. When he was a training director in the department in the late 70s, he surveyed the psychiatry residents and found that there was this huge discrepancy. On the adult side, they were learning biological psychiatry. On the child side, they were learning psychoanalysis. He said that was too confusing for the residents. And so when he took over his chair, most of the psychoanalysis basically went away. He built up lots of other things in lots of other ways, but that particular program was not something he was interested in. So here you get yet another view of the medical center. This is like early 80s. I think you can see even better where CPH is in the back. But this was the last gasp of CPH. So it got torn down in 1990 to make way for the cancer center, and then the children's psychiatric hospital, such as it was, two sad little units, got moved into the maternal child health center, MCHC, in 1990. And people would be forgiven for not realizing that there was a children's unit back there. It was buried. It was very hard to find. It was not well publicized. There was not much to it. So it's hard to say whether CPH could have been saved by somebody who was perhaps more invested in it. I suspect probably not. Again, if you see where CPH was on the map, it was torn down to make way for the cancer center. I think the cancer center in the 90s was going to be a much bigger deal than Children's Psychiatric Hospital. The length of stay, again, for children had been very long. It crept down a little bit, but when things transitioned to more managed care, it was just not sustainable to have that small number of kids for a long period of time. So there were probably many reasons why it wasn't gonna stick around. And then child inpatient psychiatry actually became such a afterthought that when the new Mott was built and opened in 2012, the children's psychiatric unit wasn't even in it. It took a little bit of activism on the part of some child psychiatrists to say, no, actually, we do need to include child psychiatry. So the new Mott was like the flip side of CPH in the first place. Instead of the psychiatry being built and the pediatrics part being forgotten, it was the pediatrics part was built and child psychiatry wasn't initially included. That was rectified, but it took a bit. So the things that really are striking to me as I think about the history of CPH, I sort of gently mock the psychoanalytic perspective, although I think that what it did do was really attend to kids in a very careful way, in a way that we don't spend that kind of time anymore. So there's something about really kind of zoning in and paying attention that certainly we do not do with computers in the room front and center the way we're practicing now. But there was something about that time, and there was also something about not having to worry about payment. The not having to constantly stress about whether a hospital stay was going to be paid for, or how long it had to be. So I don't want to get too nostalgic, but I think that there are some things that maybe would be nice to remember about this. And the other thing that is really striking in looking at the history of CPH is that people were not framing care of children in business terms. We have gotten so used to it now we don't think about it, but people talk about everything we do in teaching, in patient care, as return on investment. If it's not a return on investment, we don't want to do it. And that is not how children's psychiatric hospital people were talking about children. It was an investment in the future, but a different kind of investment. And everyone from Wagner to the teachers, to the psychiatrists, to the nurses, to everyone said, yes, this is expensive. It's time consuming and it's worth it because we are helping the next generation. And so again, maybe thinking about, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to always justify everything from a cost perspective? All right, I'm gonna end there and take questions. Thank you.
That was really interesting. That was fascinating. Like I have a whole bunch of questions, and as the host, I have the power to ask some of them. But the first question I have is, who were the children being treated there? Were they coming from the rest of the, Michigan medicine, or were they being referred, or?
That's a great question, and that actually turned into a bit of a controversial issue. So the kids were mostly referred from around the state. Some of them were local, some of them were far away, and their family doctors or if they had connections at the university would refer them. They were evaluated in an outpatient clinic, and then they were put on a waiting list. So the waiting list was 6 months to a couple years. And so there were actually some of the staff did research on the waiting list. What is it like to be on the waiting list? So they were often on the waiting list. And so they just never had enough room to take kids. They would focus primarily on kids who they believed could be helped. And there was a bit of tension around this. So at one point, so CPH was the first freestanding psychiatric hospital, children's psychiatric hospital in the country by a few minutes. University of Michigan firsts are always a little bit ephemeral, but technically it was first. There were a whole bunch of other things, and I didn't mention, and I think I distracted myself. Rabinowitz and Dubo left U of M immediately after CPH opened, conflict with the administration, and they opened Hawthorne, which continues to be a long-term residential program for kids. So there were other programs that grew up in the state, and many programs refused to take kids who were highly aggressive, and the term at the time was psychotic. It didn't mean the same thing in like the 50s and 60s that we think about it now. We use it now to mean detached from reality. This was more, they were detached from social norms, but there were some like really aggressive kids, and at one point CPH faculty wanted to take some of those kids, and they took a dozen of them, and they kept them for months, and it was a disaster. The kids broke things, they couldn't relate to staff, they upset the other children, and so they wound up discharging most of them over time, promised never to do that again. They promised their staff never to do that again. But they tried to pick kids who were either so detached from other people that they needed extra help, or they were so they were acting out so much they couldn't be managed at home. But the idea was that they were reachable. That was sort of they were treatable. That was kind of that they would be able to benefit from the care. The part that got tricky is in the 60s, they actually looked at the kids. They went and looked at the backgrounds of the kids who'd been accepted and the ones who had been refused. And you know, this is Ann Arbor. There were a bunch of liberals who were like, yeah, we have to, you know, think about social justice. And they were horrified to realize that the kids who got chosen for inpatient care, which is like the best care that they thought was available, was highly skewed toward white middle class kids. And that was the staff were really upset about that. They didn't realize that they were being so biased. And I think that they had an idea that one of the things about working with kids is that they're like pure, you know, they shouldn't have demerits already coming into the situation. And so judging a child by their social class just seemed even worse than judging adults by their social class. And yet that's where they were. And so it caused a lot of conflict and a lot of very difficult questions in the late 60s. You know, again, while the rest of the university is convulsed with political upheavals, to realize that they were discriminating was really hard. I don't think they resolved that, but they were really bothered by it.
That was a good question, yeah. And on the other side, I'm kind of curious about, you know, the staff that made up the hospital. So you know, there are undergraduates you said working with it, which is, I'm not sure, kind of a crazy thought, not to, but also, what was the term you used? Analysts? And then were those separate from the faculty? And what was the staff like for, you know, 75 patients?
So I don't know what all the numbers looked like over all the time periods, but I saw at one point, I think in the early 60s, there were 55 kids in the hospital and 44 staff members for those 55 kids, which is astonishing. Probably, if I had to guess, probably half of those would have been the attendants, the undergraduate students who worked as attendants. Significant number of nurses, probably, you know, 8 to 10 nurses, occupational therapists, and then faculty and residents. The faculty, most of the child faculty were trained as psychoanalysts. Mm-hmm. So child psychiatry training is 3 years of adult residency, 2 years of child psychiatry fellowship, and then passing some exams, and that's child psychiatry. To get certified in psychoanalysis is a whole nother like 4 years of training, involving working directly with a psychoanalyst, doing a training analysis, doing a personal analysis. It's very long and convoluted, and you have to be specially certified. And I think about half of the child faculty were also certified in psychoanalysis. And so they seem to all get along pretty well on the child side. On the adult side, not so much. But there were relatively few faculty for any given group of patients. And from a physician point of view, the person who worked most closely with each individual patient was a resident, basically a psychiatrist in training, a resident or fellow. And they would do an hour a day with each patient. That was the treatment, was an hour a day.
Wow. That's a much smaller ratio than I was expecting, honestly. And the final question I have before I want to open up to audiences, what was its, now without wanting to go too far down like departmental politics rabbit holes, what was its relationship with the broader psychiatry department? You know, the faculty and analysts who were working with adult patients, was there much overlap, or was it very much its own sort of institution?
There was very little overlap. There were a few people, I think, who were not specifically trained in child psychiatry who staffed at CPH, but for the most part, the child faculty were their own entity. And this, I think, has pretty much always been the case. I mean, it started off that way, and it's kind of continued, to be honest. But although in theory, a trained child psychiatrist could easily see adults, for the most part, the child psychiatry faculty stayed working with kids. Now, kids also meant university students. So, so there was this is a whole nother story that I would have to go and really try to trace. And I have actually a resident who's a historian who I'm hoping will take this on as a project, looking at the history of mental health services for University of Michigan students. But there were several people who were on CPH faculty who worked with U of M students, sort of thinking that like early adulthood is part of child psychiatry. So.
Interesting. Thank you. And I have several other questions, but for now I'd like to open it up to our audience, both here and online. If you have any questions, please raise your hand, and one of our docents will bring you a microphone, because that way everybody will be able to hear you. And if you have any stories about CPH, please feel free to share them.
Hi, thank you for this. Okay, thank you for this great presentation. I was a medical student here I did my clinical rotation, my child psychiatry rotation in 1991 in the back hallway on the 6th floor of the Maternal and Child Health Center. Now I didn't realize at the time that it had only been open for a year, which is just kind of a med student brain right there, thinking what you see is all it is. But what happened to all the patients? You went from 75 beds down to probably 24 beds on six cap. What happened to all those kids?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. I'd have to go and look at if they documented that transition. I think that there were definitely, it might have been depending on the time of year. The census for the hospital for CPH varied quite a bit depending on the season. So during the summer, it was virtually empty. So if they switched over in the summer, they could have done it without discharging anybody. So that I'm not sure about the timing, but that's a really good question. I think the hospital has been pretty good about not like kicking people out. They really put some thought into this about how to make those transitions. I haven't seen it documented. So that is, I'm curious about that, and I'm curious about how it got framed to go from this like building that was its own thing with a swimming pool into the back hallway. How anybody could have presented that as like, this is a good thing.
It's a follow-up question to that too. I don't know if you have the answer to this, but was there a dramatic decrease in length of stay just with the transition from the old CPH to, I'll just call it the back hall?
Yeah, it had started to come down. I think the peak was 2 years was sort of the average, and then with managed care in the late 70s, early 80s, it started to come down to for 6 months, and then 2 months, and then I think it was hovering around a month or two by then, but even before the transition. But that was mostly financial.
Great. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
I think we have.
A question from one of our online listeners. Are there any long-term outcomes data?
About the hospital stay?
I believe
Yeah.
it doesn't specify, but yeah.
That's a great question, and I don't think we have any, talking to people many years after the hospital stay. I don't think we have that, and I think that's a really good question, because I've had people come and tell me bad stories about how being in the hospital for a really long time disrupted development, but I don't think anybody followed up with anybody. And I think, given the nature of hospital records, I don't know that would even be possible. I think it would be a really important oral history project, and I would love if people, that's something that has crossed my mind about like putting out a call, share your stories. But I don't think nobody's actually looked at that. And there aren't good long-term follow-up studies about most aspects of medicine. Once people leave our doors, we don't really talk about it anymore. But I think it's a really important question. I think the thing with it, so what I'm doing, this particular project is a small piece of a bigger project on the history of child psychiatry that I've been working on for the last 10 years. That actually got stimulated after I was asked to give a talk at the new Mott when it opened, talking about the history of children in the hospital. But this idea of sort of focusing on childhood in mental health it's critical. We've been talking about it for more than a century about what it means to take care of kids. But what we don't necessarily do is reflect on the fact that these kids we're working with are going to be adults in 5 minutes. and then they're going to continue to be adults, and then they're going to have their own kids. And so there has been very little conversation other than just sort of, reflecting on changes in sort of parenting traditions. And then some generation, we're not really thinking about the fact that the kids we treated are now adults, and the kids we're treating now will be adults. And what does that mean? We lose track of that. And so there isn't a whole lot of good conversation about it. So that's a great question. Yeah.
Well, I worked on the adult unit, but I did notice that if you were on the child unit for a length of time, and then you were discharged and you had to come back to the hospital for something, they had a really difficult time in the adult unit because it was a whole different set of responsibilities and the way we functioned, and it was so alien to them that you can know some of them really struggled with that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The child unit then and now even continues this sort of developmental idea that we're working with kids, and we're acting as, the staff is acting as parents, and we're educating them. That abruptly changes when the kids turn 18 and then they become adults on the adult unit, and there's no continuity. And as far as I can tell, there was very little, if any, conversation going on a national level or here about what it meant that kids would age out of a children's psychiatric hospital and maybe would need to go and be a patient in an adult hospital. Like those conversations never happened. And again, it's like, people grow up and yet that's not something that people thought about, which is, it's amazing to me. It's like, they left the kids section and all of a sudden they're in a new world and nobody talks about it. No, that's great, thank you.
You were talking in the first part of your talk about the draw to putting this hospital in an academic setting. Are they reacting against something when they're doing that? Are they like we're going to go to a university because we don't want it to be like X? Or, because you also mentioned something about connections to like juvenile delinquency and the way it was conceptualized. Was there some reaction against that, or is it not about that?
So that's a great question. It's yes and no. So I think that there were certain, and this was actually a subject of a lot of debate among child psychiatrists in the 50s and 60s. So the Professional Organization of Child Psychiatrists, the American Academy of Child Psychiatry, that was founded in 1953, and it became the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, late 80s, early 90s. That came from both the child guidance people who were working with the juvenile delinquents and also the child psychoanalysts and also a group of pediatricians who sort of wandered into mental health. So it's these three groups together, and they didn't really cohere together very well. They wanted to be more professional. Some of them looked to academic institutions as a way of being more professionals. Others didn't, though, because analysis was taught in psychoanalytic institutes, which were in the United States, by definition, not part of universities. So the psychoanalytic institutes basically refused on a national level to be part of universities. And in fact, Wagner kind of promised Nahara that he would build an institute here, and the dean said, oh, no. You will not do that. You will not promise that. We can't do that. And so it was sort of professionalizing, sort of like we need more knowledge, but it wasn't. It was not a given that anybody wanted to do it, and so it remained kind of murky. Was academic psychiatry going to be leading child psychiatry? Nobody really knew, and that, again, it remained somewhat controversial. That's not where the sort of power in the profession was. So, yeah.
We have another online question. What, if any, evidence did you find of family involvement with the children while the children were in residence?
Great question. Very little family involvement. The kids were basically, their families did the intake with them. The social workers would work with the families and would provide some parent education. But then the parents went away and the kids stayed, and the parents would come and pick the kids up for visits, and they would go home, but the parents were not part of the treatment. And it was very much the mentality that, and the assumption, it wasn't necessarily said explicitly that the parents are the problem, but that was kind of the assumption that the parents were the problem, that if the parents were that good, then the kids wouldn't have been there in the first place. And so, they were sympathetic to parents, but they worked with them separately, but the sort of doing family guidance together, that was something that could happen on an outpatient basis, and that's what the child guidance clinics were really about, was working very intensely with the parents, sometimes even more than the kids. Sometimes, especially the moms, got a lot of attention from social workers and sometimes psychiatrists. In the hospital, not very much. I can't find evidence of visiting hours. I mean, they may have been there, but I can't find much about that. I don't know if you guys remember anything about hearing about parents' involvement. We have some nurses from the old days. We're all the old days at this point.
They would go to school.
Oh, sorry. Would you mind please waiting for a microphone?
But I remember the nurses telling me they would go to school in the morning, and then in the afternoon, after school was over, it seemed like the PCWs would take over, and they'd go for bike rides or walks or hikes or things, and that was just, they go camping on the weekend. So we never heard much about parents.
Yeah.
They certainly didn't go camping with them or anything.
Yeah. And I think there was a significant cadre of kids, again, kids we would probably characterize as autistic now. They didn't do that at the time, but who essentially were kind of dropped off at the hospital and not ever picked up again. And so there were some placement issues with some of the kids where they went to somebody else's home after a few years. So I don't think working with families was something that happened particularly.
Oh, and there was a kind of a related follow-up, but I think you just answered it. But were there any changes to the norms and expectations around family development over time, or was that pretty much?
I haven't seen evidence of change. There could very well have been, but I haven't found any discussions about working with families. I think certainly not during the years of CPH. I think things are dramatically different now. I mean, the Children's Hospital, right, Children's Psychiatric Hospital now, they have no visiting hours. Families can be there all day if they want. And that was not what CPH had back in the day. So I don't know. I know it's really interesting because in the medical side, before Mott, even when kids were on the various units of the old Maine, and then after Mott was built, there was the tradition was that nurses would be the substitute mothers for kids in the hospital, and parents were not allowed to visit. And that was like kids would go into the hospital for months for things like spinal injuries, and they wouldn't see their parents. And that was the norm. And it was actually child psychiatrists who pointed out that this was really damaging to not have parents be able to visit. And so that opened up a lot more visiting on the children's medical side, but not on the psychiatry side.
That's kind of interesting, considering it's the psychiatrists who are saying, hey, you need to let them.
Yeah.
Well, I have another question. Simply you mentioned sort of payment, and a couple of times in your talk. And can you talk a little more about sort of the evolution of that? Was there an initial no charge for services or staying at the hospital?
Well, the state paid for it. Basically, the hospital had a line item from the state, and then there was and I apologize, I don't know all the details. There was a state fund that was called the Crippled Children's Fund, and I don't know when that originated. I don't know if that was like a late 19th century fund or if that was in the 20th century. But crippled was defined very broadly to also include mental health, and so that fund of the state would pay for children to be at this hospital. So payment was not something that was ever discussed with patients. That it was just if they came here, if they needed it. It wasn't payment that got in the way. It was space. And so then it's a great question, and I don't know kind of what happened with the state funding, but at some point the Crippled Children's Commission stopped paying for child mental health, and it was probably in the 60s when Medicare and Medicaid originated, because Medicare and Medicaid changed all kinds of financing structures in psychiatry in some very interesting ways.
Okay. Well, I'm going to end my questions with the most important question I've asked. Do you happen to remember the name of the Skeezer movie? What's the title of it?
I think it's called Skeezer. I think, and because if you, I pulled it up. It's on YouTube.
That was going to be my other question.
Yeah, it's on YouTube. Skeezer, 1982 on YouTube, and Karen Valentine plays the therapist who I don't remember if she's a nurse in the film, but that she's got the dog. Yeah, she's a nurse. Yeah, and the dog's very cute. Again, much cuter than the real Skeezer.
Well, I'm going to have to check that out. Thank you. Last chance for questions. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. Thanks as well to Greg Parker, the director of the Detroit Observatory, for monitoring the live stream comments, and to our wonderful Michigan media team for recording our session this evening. Tonight's session will be available online in about a week, and will be shared with everybody who registered either in person or virtually, so you can watch it again, share it, do whatever you'd like with it. Our next Making Michigan will be on February 19th of next year, when we will be joined by the Inclusive History Project's Hill Auditorium research team, who will share with us some of their research they're doing into the history of that iconic campus building, the other iconic campus building other than the Detroit Observatory. For those of you here with us tonight at the Observatory, the original 1850s observatory upstairs will be open until about 8 o'clock. We have some really incredible student docents to share things about it, and I'll just say they do a really fascinating job. If you want to see some 19th century telescopes and learn about a history of astronomy, they do a great job. I don't know if we'll be observing tonight. It's kind of cold and the weather's not great, so probably not. But we do have open hours every Thursday and Friday afternoons and evenings. Please join us sometime for then, and I promise then you can look through the telescopes. Until then, thank you again for joining us. Have a wonderful evening. Stay warm.